The wagon creaked over the rough, dirt streets of the small cattle town, the sun dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the town. Clayton Merrick's hands gripped the reins tightly as his horses plodded along, kicking up clouds of dust. Beside him, his 7-year-old son, Samuel, sat quietly, his eyes wide with curiosity, taking in the scene. It was a warm evening, and the streets were bustling with the last of the day's trade. The general store was just ahead, where a handful of townfolk lingered, chatting and waving at Clayton as he passed. The sight of the old wooden store brought back memories for Clayton. His life had changed so much in the last 7 years. His first wife, Caroline, had disappeared without a trace, and he had been left to raise their young son alone. Clayton had never quite forgiven himself for how things had ended with her, but life had moved on. He'd remarried a woman named Helen, and they'd made a home on a ranch. Helen had done everything she could for Samuel, but there was still a void in Clayton's heart where Caroline used to be. He couldn't help but wonder, sometimes, what had really happened to her, why she'd vanished without a word. It was then that Clayton saw her. A woman sitting at the edge of the boardwalk, her back hunched, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She was holding a small, tattered sign asking for spare change. The harsh sun had worn away at her, and she looked as though she had been sitting there for days, maybe weeks, the dirt caked on her clothes and skin. Something about the way she sat, still and quiet, sent a shiver through Clayton's spine. For a moment, he thought he saw something familiar in the set of her shoulders, a glimpse of someone he thought he had lost forever. He tried to shake the thought away, but then he heard Samuel's voice, soft and hesitant. "Father, that's my mother." Clayton froze, his hand tightening on the reins, his heart skipping a beat. He glanced over at Samuel, his eyes wide with confusion. "What did you say, son?" Samuel pointed toward the woman, his small finger trembling as he spoke again. "Her hands, father. The scar on her thumb. I remember." Clayton's breath caught in his throat. It couldn't be. It was impossible. His wife had vanished so many years ago without a trace, and he had long buried the memory of her departure. His mind raced. Could it really be her? He hadn't seen Caroline in so long, not since the night she'd left. He'd never known why, only that she had promised to return and then never came back. And now, here she was, begging for scraps outside the general store, as though nothing had changed. His eyes locked onto the woman's hands, her knuckles rough and weathered, but there, unmistakable, was the scar, a small, thin line, a remnant from an accident years ago. Clayton's heart hammered in his chest. It couldn't be a coincidence. But before he could make sense of it, the woman looked up. Their eyes met for a brief, fleeting moment. Her gaze was filled with a strange mix of recognition and pain, as though she, too, knew the truth. But before he could speak, before he could say her name, she turned and ran, her ragged dress flapping behind her as she disappeared into a narrow alleyway between the buildings. Clayton's mind whirled. She knew him. She knew Samuel. But why had she run? Why hadn't she stopped to speak? Clayton snapped out of his daze and urged the horses forward, his heart pounding in his chest. "Wait here, son," he said, his voice tight with uncertainty. He climbed down from the wagon, his legs unsteady as he moved toward the alley, desperate to catch up with the woman. But as he turned the corner, there was no sign of her. The alley was empty, as though she had vanished into thin air. Samuel's small voice interrupted his thoughts. "I've seen her 3 times before, father. I was afraid to tell you." Clayton turned to see his son standing by the wagon, his face pale, his eyes filled with guilt. Clayton's chest tightened, a mix of anger and confusion bubbling up. "You've seen her?" he asked, his voice rough. "Where? Why didn't you tell me?" Samuel shifted uneasily, his small hands wringing the hem of his shirt. "I didn't know what to say. I didn't want to hurt you." Clayton's mind spun with questions. Samuel had known? Samuel had seen his mother all this time, and he hadn't said anything? Why had she been so close, yet never reached out? What had happened to her? And why had she disappeared from their lives so suddenly? As the reality of the situation sank in, Clayton felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The woman he had loved, the mother of his child, was alive. But where had she been all this time? And why had she kept herself hidden, a ghost in the shadows of their lives? His thoughts turned back to the ranch, to Helen, who would be waiting for him at home. Helen, who had given him a second chance at love, a second chance at family. What would she say if she knew the truth? What would she think if she knew Caroline had returned? A soft voice broke through his thoughts. "We have to find her, Father. Please, I need to know why she left me." Clayton turned to look at his son, whose small hand gripped his arm with a fierce desperation. His heart ached for Samuel, who had been carrying the weight of his mother's absence for so long. Clayton knew then that he couldn't ignore this. They couldn't just let the past stay buried. Samuel needed answers, and so did he. Clayton nodded, his resolve hardening. "We will, son," he said quietly. "We'll find her. We'll get the answers." And as they drove the wagon toward home, the glow of lamplight from the ranch house flickered in the distance, waiting for them. But Clayton couldn't shake the feeling that their lives, their family, would never be the same again. Clayton stood frozen in the doorway, the journal still clenched in his hand, the words of Caroline's sacrifice echoing in his mind. Caroline's eyes flickered with a mixture of shame and desperation as she stepped further into the room, her thin frame barely filling the doorway. The silence stretched between them, thick with years of unsaid words, of pain that neither of them had been able to escape. Clayton's heart ached as he took a tentative step toward her, but his voice caught in his throat. For a moment, he was trapped in the past, in that night when she had walked away without a word, leaving him to carry the weight of her absence. But now, here she was standing in front of him, the mother of his child, a woman he had thought lost forever. "Caroline," Clayton's voice broke through the silence, raw and uncertain. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come back?" Caroline flinched, her face pale, her hands trembling. She glanced down at the journal in Clayton's hand, the weight of its truth hanging between them. Her voice was barely a whisper as she spoke. "I couldn't. I made a promise to Silas Kane. He would have killed you, Clayton. He would have killed us all if I told you why I left. You don't understand. I had to protect you. I had to protect Samuel." Clayton's stomach twisted at the mention of Kane's name. The ruthless land baron who had never cared for anyone but his own interests, the man who had threatened to take everything from Clayton. He suddenly realized that his debts, his pride, had put Caroline in an impossible position. It wasn't just the ranch or the money, it was their lives. Caroline had chosen to sacrifice everything to save them, to keep them safe from a man who would have crushed them without hesitation. Clayton felt a flood of guilt rise in him, thick and suffocating. "I didn't know. I didn't know you were suffering," he murmured, looking down at the journal in his hands. "I blamed you for leaving, but it wasn't you. It was Kane. It was my fault. My pride put you in that position." Caroline shook her head, her voice trembling as she stepped closer to him. "No, Clayton, it was my choice. I did it because I loved you. I loved Samuel, but I couldn't destroy you. I couldn't let Kane take you from him. It was the only way." Clayton's heart cracked at the raw pain in her voice. He had never imagined the lengths she had gone to, the torment she had endured. And then, the journal's final entry struck him with a force that made him dizzy. The revelation that Kane was dead. Caroline was free, but the world had moved on without her, and there was no place for her to return to. The ranch, the life they had once dreamed of together, had been replaced by years of solitude and hardship. Caroline had given up everything, even the chance of ever coming back to her family. But now, with Kane gone, there was nothing left to stop her from returning, except the life that Clayton had built with Helen. Clayton felt the weight of it all, of the years spent grieving a loss that hadn't even been her choice, of the guilt that had kept him from ever asking the questions that now seemed so urgent. And there was Samuel, who had been holding on to a hope he didn't even know he had, waiting for the mother he had lost to come back. Samuel had known, had seen her, had hoped. Clayton's heart ached for his son, who had carried so much pain in silence. "She's been watching us," Clayton whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "She's been watching him." Caroline's eyes flickered with sorrow as she nodded. "I couldn't bear to see him grow up without you, Clayton. I couldn't bear to see him with a stranger in your place. But I couldn't let him know. It was too dangerous. I couldn't risk it." Clayton felt his chest tighten. He wanted to reach out to her, to pull her close and make everything right again, but there was no simple fix. The years had stretched between them like an uncrossable canyon, and the damage done couldn't just be undone. She was still the woman he had once loved, but everything had changed. Samuel's voice broke through the tension. "Why didn't you come back, Mama? Why didn't you come home?" The words hung in the air like a fragile thread. Caroline closed her eyes for a moment, as though gathering strength. When she spoke again, her voice was thick with emotion. "I wanted to, sweetheart. I wanted to so badly. But I couldn't. I made a promise. I had to stay away." Clayton watched his son's face, saw the confusion, the hurt, the longing that had never truly gone away. Samuel didn't understand the complexities, the sacrifices, the threats that had driven his mother away. All he saw was the woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace. The same woman who now stood before him, a stranger, a ghost from the past. Caroline stepped back, her hands folded in front of her, her expression a mixture of hope and fear. "I didn't come back to ruin your life, Clayton. I never wanted to cause more pain. I just wanted to see Samuel again, to know he was okay, to know he was loved." The words struck Clayton like a fist to the chest. Caroline's love for Samuel had never wavered, never faltered. And yet, she had stayed away for so long, always in the shadows, never daring to reach out. He didn't know how to process it all, how to reconcile the woman who had been his wife with the woman who had disappeared without explanation. "You can't leave again," Samuel said suddenly, his small voice fierce. "You can't go. I won't let you." His words were a plea, a desperate cry from a child who had been without his mother for too long. Clayton looked at Caroline, his heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to say. He knew this was a crossroads, a moment where the decisions they made would shape their futures for better or worse. Caroline's voice was quiet as she spoke, the decision clear in her eyes. "I can't stay, Clayton. I won't destroy your new life. I just wanted to see him one last time, to know he was okay." The words cut through Clayton, sharp and final. But as he looked at her, at the woman who had sacrificed everything for their safety, he knew there was one thing he had to do. "Come with us," he said, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Come to the ranch. Stay in the guest cottage. Get better. For Samuel." Caroline hesitated, a shadow passing over her face, but then she nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Only because he asked. Only because I can't leave him again." And so, the path forward was set, a fragile thread of hope weaving through the tangled mess of their past. But Clayton knew that this was only the beginning. The real battle was yet to come, and it was not just about forgiveness. It was about how to rebuild a family that had been shattered, how to find peace in a world that had long forgotten how to heal. The wagon ride back to the ranch was a quiet one, the air thick with unspoken words and heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. Clayton couldn't look at Caroline. His mind was still reeling from the revelations in the journal and the look in her eyes when she had spoken of the years she spent in hiding, of the sacrifices she had made to protect him, to protect Samuel. But now, here she was sitting beside him in the wagon, frail and weathered, her hands trembling in her lap. Clayton's heart ached as he glanced at Samuel, who sat between them, his face lit up with hope and excitement. The boy was talking nonstop, oblivious to the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. "I can't wait to tell Helen," Samuel said with a bright smile, his voice full of innocence. "She'll be so happy to meet you, Mama. She'll want to make you pie." Clayton's throat tightened at the mention of Helen. The wife he had married after Caroline had disappeared, the woman who had helped him raise his son, who had made a life with him. But now, as the wagon bumped along the dirt road, Clayton wasn't sure how to explain to Helen that the woman she had never met, the woman who had been a ghost in their lives for 7 years, was now sitting in their guest cottage. How was he supposed to explain the years of pain, of guilt, of unresolved feelings that had haunted him all this time? How could he tell her that, no matter how much he loved her, part of him would always belong to Caroline? The ranch house loomed ahead, the lights of home flickering in the distance. It should have felt like a sanctuary, a place of peace and stability. But Clayton couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The land, the cattle, the house, none of it mattered if the foundations of their family weren't strong. Clayton's thoughts were interrupted as Samuel leaned forward in his seat, his small hand reaching out to grab his father's arm. "We have to tell her, don't we, Father? She has to know the truth." Clayton nodded slowly, his eyes flicking to Caroline, who sat silently, staring out at the landscape as it passed by. She hadn't said a word since they'd left the mill. Clayton wasn't sure if she was avoiding eye contact with him or if she simply didn't know what to say. He couldn't blame her. This wasn't a conversation anyone was prepared for. When they arrived at the ranch, the warm light from the windows of the main house felt like a beacon, promising safety and normalcy. But Clayton knew that nothing would ever be the same again. He helped Caroline down from the wagon, and they made their way to the guest cottage behind the house. Samuel was beside himself with excitement, chattering about what they would do once Caroline was settled. But Clayton could see the tension in Caroline's shoulders, the way she held herself stiffly, as though bracing for something she couldn't avoid. She wasn't used to being in the light anymore, to being a part of this world she had left behind. Clayton walked beside her, a steady presence in the quiet evening. When they reached the guest cottage, he turned to her and spoke softly. "You'll be safe here. You can rest, recover, and we'll figure out what comes next." Caroline nodded, her eyes cast downward. "I never meant to cause trouble for you, Clayton. I didn't come back to tear apart what you've built with Helen. I just wanted to see Samuel. I just wanted to know he was okay." Clayton felt a pang of guilt. He could hear the pain in her voice, the self-imposed guilt she carried from so many years of silence. But he also knew that he couldn't change the past, no matter how much it haunted him. They had to move forward for Samuel's sake, for their sake. "We'll talk about everything, Caroline. I promise," Clayton said, his voice firm but gentle. "But first, you need to rest. You've been through so much." Caroline didn't respond, but he could see the gratitude in her eyes as she stepped into the cottage. Clayton paused at the doorway, watching her disappear into the shadows of the small building. His mind raced with the countless possibilities of what would come next. The ranch was quiet now, the cattle grazing peacefully in the distance. But Clayton couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was brewing. His wife, Helen, was still inside, waiting for him, unaware of the woman who had just entered their lives again. He had no idea how he was going to explain it to her, how he would make her understand. He had built a life with Helen, a life that had become comfortable, secure. But now, Caroline had returned, and with her, the past Clayton had long buried was suddenly very much alive. As he turned to walk back to the main house, he caught a glimpse of Helen standing on the porch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She didn't need to say a word for Clayton to know that something had changed. She had sensed it, felt it in the air, just as he had. "Clayton," Helen called out, her voice cautious, almost guarded. "You're home. I wasn't sure when you'd be back." Clayton's heart sank. The look on her face was one of confusion and uncertainty. She had been waiting for him, but what was she expecting? Was she waiting for the man she had married, the man she had trusted to keep their life stable? Or was she waiting for someone else entirely? He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the conversation that was about to unfold. "Helen," he began, his voice low, "there's something I need to tell you." The words felt like lead in his mouth. How could he explain this? How could he explain the woman who had once been his wife, who had disappeared without a trace, only to return as a ghost in the middle of their lives. Helen's eyes narrowed, sensing the weight of his words. "What's going on, Clayton? Why are you looking at me like that?" Clayton hesitated for a moment, searching for the right words. But there were no right words, only the truth he had kept buried for so long. "Helen, Caroline is back," he said softly. "She's here. She's alive." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and impossible to ignore. Helen's face paled, her mouth opening slightly as if trying to process the enormity of what he had just said. Clayton watched as her emotions shifted, her brow furrowing with confusion, then quickly hardening into something else, something that might have been fear or maybe even anger. He didn't know, and at that moment neither did she. Helen didn't speak for a long time, and the silence between them grew thick with tension, more suffocating than the stifling summer air. Clayton could see the struggle in her eyes, the mix of disbelief and hurt that twisted her features. He had told her the truth, or at least part of it, but he knew it wasn't enough. He had expected her reaction, shock, confusion, the rush of emotion she was now trying to sort through, but knowing it would happen didn't make it any easier to bear. He watched as Helen's lips pressed into a tight line, and her eyes briefly flicked over his shoulder, as though seeking something, anything, to anchor herself. "So she's back. After all these years," Helen finally said, her voice cold and clipped. "And you brought her here." The words stung, sharper than Clayton had expected, but he didn't flinch. "I didn't know what else to do, Helen. She's Samuel's mother. She had nowhere else to go." Helen's eyes flashed with something close to panic. "So what now, Clayton? What do you want me to do? Open the door and welcome her in like nothing happened? Like she didn't just disappear, leaving me to pick up the pieces?" There was no accusation in her voice, only an unbearable sadness that made Clayton feel the weight of the years they had spent together, the life they had built. He could feel the gulf between them widening with every passing second. He wanted to reach for her, to explain, but there were no words that could smooth over the years of unanswered questions and raw emotions. "I don't know what you expect from me," Helen continued, her voice trembling now, revealing the hurt that she had kept hidden for so long. "You want me to accept her into our home? Into our family? When she's been gone all this time? When she just shows up out of nowhere like some ghost from the past?" Clayton's heart twisted as he saw the confusion and the pain in Helen's eyes. She had been his partner, his rock. She had built a life with him, and now that life felt fragile, as though it could crumble to dust at any moment. "Helen, I never wanted this," Clayton said, his voice rough. "I never wanted you to feel like this. I never wanted to hurt you. But you need to understand, Caroline never left because she didn't want us. She left because she was protecting us." Helen shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "Protecting you? From what?" "From her own mistakes." Clayton winced at the harshness in her voice, but he pressed on. "From Silas Kane. She made a deal with him. She left so that Kane wouldn't come after me, after Samuel. She did to save us. She kept her distance because it was the only way to keep us alive." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with the weight of the truth. Helen's expression faltered for a brief moment, the anger giving way to confusion, then something deeper, a sorrow that Clayton couldn't place. I don't understand," Helen whispered. "Why didn't you tell me, Clayton? Why didn't you trust me with the truth?" Her voice cracked as the tears she had been holding back for so long began to surface. Clayton reached for her, but she stepped back, her face a mixture of disbelief and hurt. "Helen, I didn't want to drag you into this," he said, his voice raw. "I didn't want to hurt you. I thought I could bury it. That would just be a part of the past. But now I realize I was wrong. I should have told you. I should have trusted you." Helen's gaze softened, but the pain in her eyes remained. "You've always kept things from me, Clayton. You kept your past with Caroline hidden, and I've always been the one left to fill in the gaps, to pick up the pieces. I thought we were building a life together, but now I'm not sure what we're building at all." Clayton swallowed hard. I didn't mean for it to be like this. I didn't mean to shut you out, but I thought that if I told you, it would change everything. And I didn't want to lose you. Well, it's too late for that, isn't it? Helen's voice broke, and for the first time, Clayton saw just how deep the wound had gone. She had been living with a shadow of the past hanging over her, a past she hadn't even known about. And now it was here, standing in front of them both, threatening to tear everything apart. Clayton could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. The choice between the woman he had promised to love for better or worse, and the woman who had once been the love of his life, who had sacrificed everything for him. He didn't know how to bridge that gap. He didn't know how to make it right. I know this isn't easy, Clayton said, his voice barely above a whisper. But we have to find a way through this, Helen. For Samuel. For us. We can't let this break us. Helen's gaze softened, but only just. I'm not sure I can do this, Clayton, she said, her voice trembling. I don't know how to just accept her back into our lives, into our home. I don't know how to share you, how to share our son with her. Clayton felt a sharp pang in his chest, but he didn't back down. I don't know how to do this either, he admitted. But I do know one thing. We can't keep pretending like everything's fine. We have to face this together. We have to figure out what comes next. And maybe, just maybe, we can find a way to make it work. But we have to try. For Samuel's sake, if nothing else. Helen's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't turn away. She let the tears fall freely, her shoulders trembling with the weight of it all. I don't know how, Clayton. I really don't. Clayton stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. We'll figure it out, one step at a time. We'll rebuild this, even if it's hard, even if it feels impossible. The silence between them grew heavy, but there was something else in the air now, something fragile, something worth fighting for. They weren't there yet, not by a long shot, but maybe, just maybe, they could start again. Helen took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. I don't know how to forgive her, but I'll try. Clayton nodded, his heart aching with the weight of her words. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a way forward. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be hard days ahead, but they would face it together. And that, for now, was enough. The morning sun rose slowly over the ranch, casting a soft golden light across the fields as Clayton and Caroline made their way to the house. Samuel was already up, as usual, eager to start his day. But Clayton could feel the tension in the air. Helen had barely spoken to him since their conversation the night before, her silence hanging between them like an unspoken wall. He didn't know what to expect when he saw her again, but he knew that things had shifted irrevocably. Caroline, too, was quiet beside him. She hadn't said much since their conversation the previous evening, her face still pale, her movements stiff with the uncertainty of her return. Clayton had insisted that she stay in the guest cottage to rest and recover, but he could see that she was struggling, trying to find her place in a life she had been absent from for so long. Clayton didn't know how to make this work, how to navigate the fragile peace they had begun to build. It felt like everything was teetering on the edge of some inevitable collapse. As they walked toward the house, Clayton saw Helen standing on the porch, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. She was watching them approach, her face unreadable, and Clayton's heart sank. He had hoped that, after a night's sleep, things might have settled, but it was clear that Helen was still processing everything. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, the weight of her gaze felt like 1,000 unspoken words. Before Clayton could speak, Samuel ran up to him, his voice full of excitement. "Father, I found something," the boy exclaimed. Clayton felt a flicker of hope, his son's innocent enthusiasm momentarily lifting his spirits. But as Samuel pulled away, Clayton noticed that something was missing. His son was nowhere to be seen, his sudden disappearance causing a wave of panic to rise in Clayton's chest. "Samuel," Clayton called out, his voice sharp with concern. His pulse quickened as he scanned the ranch, but the boy was nowhere to be found. His heart thudded painfully in his chest, as he rushed toward the barn, his mind racing. Where could Samuel have gone? Caroline, too, had noticed the sudden shift in atmosphere, and she called out, "Clayton, where's Samuel?" Clayton didn't answer. His mind was focused entirely on finding his son, his heart hammering with a mixture of fear and guilt. Had he been so distracted by everything else that he hadn't noticed Samuel slip away? Had the boy been so desperate for some semblance of normalcy that he had gone looking for something, anything, to hold on to in this fractured world? Clayton's eyes darted around, his feet moving faster than his thoughts, and it wasn't long before he found the trail of Samuel's small footprints leading toward the old mill, the very same place where Caroline had first reappeared. His chest tightened with dread as he realized where the boy had gone. Samuel had been there before, drawn to the place where his mother had hidden for so many years, and now, it seemed, he was returning there in search of answers. Clayton quickened his pace, his heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. The lies, the secrets, the fear, and now, the possibility of losing his son to the same shadows that had haunted Caroline for so long. When he reached the mill, he called out Samuel's name, his voice breaking as he stepped into the dim interior. "Samuel!" His voice echoed off the walls, bouncing back to him like some cruel reminder of the silence that had marked the last 7 years. Then he saw him. Samuel was curled up in a corner of the mill, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his face hidden in the crook of his elbow. Clayton's breath caught in his throat as he rushed to his son, kneeling beside him. "Samuel," he said softly, reaching out to pull the boy into his arms. "What are you doing here, son?" Samuel's small body trembled as he finally lifted his head, his eyes red from crying. "Everyone's fighting because of me," he whispered, his voice thick with sorrow. "I wish I never found Mama. I wish I never found her, because now everyone's just sad." Clayton's heart shattered as he held Samuel tighter, the weight of his son's words sinking deep into his chest. It wasn't just the revelation about Caroline that had shaken their world. It was everything that had come after. Samuel had been carrying the pain of their fractured family for so long, and now, in the wake of Caroline's return, the boy was struggling to make sense of it all. Clayton pressed his forehead against Samuel's, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You didn't cause this, Samuel. You didn't make anyone sad. This is something that we all have to work through. But we'll do it together. I promise you, we'll figure this out." Samuel's sobs racked his small frame, and Clayton held him tighter, wishing he could make everything right, wishing he could shield his son from the complexities of the world they now found themselves in. The soft rustle of footsteps behind him made Clayton's heart stop. He turned to see Caroline standing in the doorway of the mill, her face etched with worry and fear. "I couldn't let him go alone," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew he'd come here." Clayton nodded, unable to speak as he watched Caroline take a hesitant step forward, her hands trembling as she reached out for Samuel. The boy looked up at her, his eyes wide with uncertainty, and for a moment, neither of them moved. Then, in a quiet, tentative voice, Samuel spoke. "Mama, why did you leave me? Why didn't you come back?" Caroline's breath caught in her throat, and Clayton saw the pain in her eyes, the same sorrow that had lived in her heart for so long. "I couldn't, Samuel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I had to leave so that you and your father would be safe. I never wanted to hurt you, never wanted to leave you. But I had to protect you both, even if it meant being apart." Samuel's small hand reached out to her, and she took it, the two of them finally, after all these years, face to face. "I love you, Samuel," Caroline whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I always have. I always will." Samuel looked up at her with wide, tear-filled eyes, the weight of her words settling in. Clayton watched them, his heart aching for all the years lost, for the pain they had all carried in silence. But in that moment, as the sun filtered through the broken windows of the mill, he realized that this was the beginning of something new. They weren't healed yet, but they had taken the first step together. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy silence, a tentative peace that hung in the air like an unspoken truce, fragile and delicate. Clayton, Caroline, and Samuel returned to the ranch, but things were far from normal. Helen had left that morning to visit her sister in Denver, needing time away to process everything that had happened. Clayton didn't know how long she would be gone or what would happen when she returned, but in the meantime, he was left with the heavy task of trying to rebuild what had been broken. Caroline, though she had promised to stay in the guest cottage and give them space, spent her days wandering around the ranch, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness that Clayton could feel but couldn't fix. Samuel, too, was struggling to adjust. He had found a way to reconnect with his mother, but the tension between his two worlds, the one with Helen, the woman who had raised him, and the one with Caroline, the woman who had once been his mother, was becoming unbearable. It wasn't just the physical distance that had grown between them, but the emotional chasm that seemed to widen with every passing day. Clayton knew they couldn't keep living in this limbo. Something had to change, and fast. One evening, as they sat in the kitchen, Samuel's voice broke through the silence. "Mama," he said, his voice full of innocence and a quiet longing. "Can't we all just live together again? Why can't we all be a family?" His words hit Clayton like a punch to the gut. How could he explain to the boy that the world didn't work like that, that families weren't simple, that there were too many hurts, too many complications for it to ever be the same? Clayton opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Caroline, who had been standing by the stove, looked up, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and love. She stepped towards Samuel, her hands trembling as she knelt beside him. "Sweetheart, I wish it could be that simple," she said softly, her voice full of sorrow. "I really do. But life doesn't always let us have what we want. Sometimes we have to make choices that are hard, even when they break our hearts." Samuel's eyes filled with tears, and Clayton saw the desperation in the boy's face, the same desperation that had been in his own heart all these years. "But why can't we just be together?" Samuel whispered. Caroline's voice cracked as she spoke. "Because it would hurt your father too much, and it would hurt Helen, too. You don't know what it's like to love someone and then have to walk away. It's not easy, sweetheart. It's the hardest thing I've ever done." Samuel wiped his eyes, his small hand trembling as he reached for Caroline's. Clayton watched, his heart aching for his son, for the pain that he couldn't protect him from. They were standing on the edge of something new, something uncertain, and it was clear that they all had to find a way forward, even if it wasn't perfect. Later that evening, Clayton sat alone on the porch, staring out at the land he had worked so hard to build, the land that had been his pride and joy. The sunset was beautiful, casting a golden light across the ranch, but it felt hollow to him. Helen was still gone, and he wasn't sure when she would return or what she would say when she did. He couldn't blame her for needing space. This had all been so much to bear, but the weight of the uncertainty hung heavy in the air, and Clayton knew that it couldn't continue like this. As he sat there, lost in thought, a figure appeared beside him, Caroline. She had been spending more time outside, taking long walks through the fields, but tonight she had come to find him. She stood silently for a moment, looking out at the same sunset, her face drawn with the exhaustion of years spent running, hiding, and now, finally, confronting the past. "I've been thinking," Caroline began, her voice quiet but steady, "about what Samuel said today, about being a family." Clayton turned to her, his expression tired but open. "I know," he said softly. "It's what I want too, but it's not that simple. There's too much between us, too many things that have been broken, things that can't be fixed overnight." Caroline nodded slowly, her eyes filled with understanding. "I know. I don't want to tear your family apart, Clayton. I never did. I thought I was protecting you by staying away, but I see now that it's just made everything harder. You've built a life with Helen. I can't just waltz back into that and expect things to be the way they were." Clayton felt a pang of guilt, but he also felt something else, a sense of clarity that had been missing for so long. Helen has every right to feel what she feels, he said, his voice firm. But that doesn't mean we can't find a way forward. It's going to take time, but we can't keep pretending that we don't need to change, to adapt, to find a new way to be a family. It won't be easy, but it's the only chance we've got. Caroline was quiet for a moment, her eyes distant as she considered his words. So what do we do now? She asked. Clayton took a deep breath, his heart heavy but resolute. We start by facing the truth. All of it. We can't keep hiding from the reality of what's happened, of what we've all lost. But we also have to build something new, something that works for all of us. Maybe it's not what we thought it would be, but we have to make it work. Caroline looked at him, a flicker of hope in her eyes. And Helen, she asked, her voice hesitant. Clayton swallowed, knowing that this was the hardest part. We'll tell her the truth, he said quietly. She needs to understand, and I need to be honest with her, even if it means facing the consequences of what I've kept hidden for so long. Caroline nodded slowly, her face filled with quiet resolve. I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, she said softly. Clayton knew that it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like they had a chance, that maybe, just maybe, they could build something from the wreckage of their past. He didn't know what the future held, but he was willing to face it, whatever it was, with the people who mattered most, his son and the woman who had once been his wife. He only hoped it would be enough. Months passed, and with them, the fragile thread of hope that had begun to weave itself into the fabric of their lives grew stronger, though not without its struggles. Clayton's life was different now, and it wasn't just the absence of Helen, who had returned from Denver with a quiet resolve to move forward. Their relationship wasn't the same. It could never be, but the distance between them had begun to shrink slowly, day by day. They spoke more honestly, more openly, though the tension was still there, thick at times, like a storm cloud waiting to break. But Helen had made the decision to stay, to try and understand what this new version of their family could look like, even if it was nothing like what she had imagined. Clayton watched as she adapted to the presence of Caroline, who had found work in town. Caroline had opened a small seamstress shop, a modest building at the end of the main street. It wasn't much, but it was hers, and it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't had in years. Samuel visited her often, and although there was a strained quietness between Caroline and Helen, there was no denying the changes that had begun to take root. Every Sunday, they came together at the ranch, the four of them sitting around the dinner table, Clayton, Helen, Samuel, and Caroline. It was always awkward at first, the silence between Helen and Caroline palpable. But slowly, over time, those uncomfortable silences began to fade, replaced by small gestures of respect, even if unspoken. Helen had stopped seeing Caroline as a threat, though the process of forgiveness was slower, more deliberate. Caroline never pushed, never demanded more than what was given, understanding that this was something that couldn't be rushed. Each meal, each shared moment, felt like a fragile experiment, a quiet dance of compromise and understanding. On the ranch, Clayton had settled into a rhythm, the daily work of running the cattle ranch, keeping him busy, but not enough to quiet the lingering thoughts of the past. He spent more time with Samuel, taking him out to the fields, teaching him how to ride, how to manage the cattle, all the things that had been left undone for so many years. Samuel, who had once been so uncertain, now seemed more at peace. He was no longer torn between two worlds. He had found a place in both, and though it wasn't perfect, it was enough. Clayton often caught glimpses of Samuel's unguarded smile, his laughter ringing out over the fields, and he knew in his heart that the boy had found something he had been searching for. The truth was Clayton had, too. He no longer felt torn between the love he had for Helen and the love he had for Caroline. He could be the man who had loved two women, one who had given him a second chance at happiness, and one who had sacrificed everything to protect him and their son. Neither could replace the other. They were different, but each had shaped who he was. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. One Sunday afternoon, as they sat on the porch after dinner, watching the last light of day slip away behind the horizon, Caroline sat beside Clayton, her hand resting gently on his arm. She had come a long way since she first stepped back into their lives, and though there were still moments of uncertainty, she had found a place for herself in the world again. Samuel ran off to play with the dog, his laughter carrying in the distance, and Helen, who had come out to join them, stood leaning against the post, her arms crossed but her expression soft, thoughtful. There was still something there, a barrier between them, but it was thinner now, and Clayton could sense that it was starting to dissolve piece by piece. Caroline looked over at her and smiled faintly. "You know," she said softly, "I never wanted to disrupt your life, Helen. I didn't want to hurt you. I just wanted to be part of Samuel's life, to see him again. I didn't expect any of this." Helen nodded slowly, her gaze on Samuel, who was now sitting on the porch steps. His face lit up with the excitement of a new game. "I know," Helen said quietly. It's not easy, Caroline. I never imagined my life would turn out like this. But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's just different." Caroline smiled, and for the first time, it felt like there was something between them that could be called understanding. There was no need for grand gestures of reconciliation, only the quiet acceptance of each other's place in the world. "Different can be good," Caroline said softly, her voice carrying a quiet wisdom that came from years of hardship and sacrifice. Clayton felt a swell of gratitude for Caroline, for the strength she had shown, and for the way she had quietly accepted the changes in their lives without demanding more than she deserved. It had been a long road, one filled with pain and missteps, but it had brought them here, to this moment. They were still learning how to navigate this new dynamic, still figuring out what it meant to be a family, but they were doing it together. For the first time, Clayton could feel the weight of the past lifting. It wasn't about erasing the mistakes or pretending they never happened. It was about accepting them, learning from them, and moving forward. And as the evening sun dipped lower, painting the sky in rich hues of amber and gold, Clayton looked at his two families sitting side by side, and he knew that they had created something new. It wasn't perfect, wasn't easy, but it was theirs. And that was enough. Samuel ran back to them, his face beaming with excitement as he showed off some new trick he'd learned with the rope. Clayton couldn't help but laugh as his son tried to show off, the boy's enthusiasm infectious. And as the family sat together, watching the stars begin to twinkle in the night sky, Clayton realized that the miracle wasn't in fixing the past. It was in the courage to build something new from the broken pieces of what had come before. As the night settled around them, Clayton sat back, feeling a peace he hadn't known in years, knowing that despite everything, despite the pain and the heartache, they had found a way to be whole again. And in that quiet, unexpected moment, he understood something simple but profound. Family wasn't about who came first or who stayed the longest. It was about who showed up, who loved, and who was brave enough to try. And sometimes, the greatest miracle was simply the courage to start over,